In a world that never stops talking, silence has become a forgotten power. We speak to fill space. We speak to be heard. We speak often without knowing why. But Buddhism teaches, what we say shapes who we become, and what we don't say often says more. To speak less is not to withdraw. It is to become intentional. It is to create space between noise and meaning, between impulse and wisdom. This is not about being quiet. It's about choosing your words like a monk chooses his steps, with presence, with care, with clarity. Buddhist monks take a vow of right speech, not just to avoid lies or harm, but to treat every word as sacred. Before speaking, they ask, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? If not, they remain silent, because silence, in its purest form, isn't absence. It's awareness. It's a space where your mind can breathe, where thoughts aren't rushed into noise, where presence replaces performance. And in that silence, the truth often arrives. Have you ever said something and regretted it the moment it left your mouth? We all have. Words spoken in anger, in fear, in ego. And once they're out, they echo, not just in others' minds, but in your own. Buddhism teaches, speech carries karma. Every word has weight. So when you speak, you're not just expressing, you're planting, and the harvest is yours to reap. That's why the wise speak slowly, or not at all. There's a Zen saying, speak only if it improves upon the silence, because silence is not emptiness, it is presence, purified. When you stop talking, something beautiful happens. You start listening, not just to others, but to yourself, your breath, your intuition, your buried truths, and the quieter your voice becomes, the louder your awareness grows. If you feel drained by constant talking, if your mind needs a moment of peace, then take this as your invitation to pause, because silence is not isolation. It's a return to clarity, to balance, to inner calm. Subscribe to Echoing Zen and tap the bell to walk the quiet path with us. Your peace begins the moment you stop performing for the noise. Silence teaches restraint, and restraint is strength. Not the kind that suppresses, but the kind that observes. When you pause before speaking, you give yourself a chance to respond instead of react. And in that pause, your wisdom steps forward. The less you speak, the more your words begin to mean. Because you're not speaking to impress, you're speaking to connect, and connection begins in presence. Buddhism reminds us, much of our suffering begins in speech. Gossip, complaining, blame, all are habits of a restless mind. But when you practice noble silence, your inner world settles. You no longer chase being right. You no longer need to fill the void. You rest in simplicity. And through that stillness, your awareness sharpens like a blade. Quiet, but powerful. When you stop speaking out of habit, you begin to notice how often others speak just to avoid silence. They fill the air with noise, out of discomfort, out of fear, out of loneliness. But when you're rooted in stillness, you don't need to fill the space. You are the space, and your calmness becomes a mirror, reflecting the unrest in others and offering them a chance to settle too. Some people will misunderstand your silence. They'll think you're distant, cold, detached, but your silence isn't a wall. It's a sanctuary. It's where you hear the soft truths that noise drowns out. You don't need to explain your peace. You just need to live it. And in doing so, you become a gentle reminder to the world. Presence speaks louder than performance. In monasteries, there are entire days reserved for noble silence. No talking, no gestures, just breath, just being. And in those quiet hours, the monks say the mind becomes clearer than any scripture. You begin to see the root of your suffering and the seed of your freedom. That's the gift of speaking less. You hear your truth, and more importantly, you stop believing every thought that crosses your mind. Silence is not always comfortable, especially in a world addicted to noise. But that discomfort is a doorway. It reveals your fears, your impulses, your need to be heard. And when you don't run from it, you begin to understand it. Buddhism teaches that truth rises in still waters, not in stormy waves. So the less you stir the mind with words, the clearer you see what's really there. Have you ever listened so deeply that someone felt seen without you saying a word? That's the power of presence. When you speak less, you listen more, and in that listening, you become a healer. Your attention becomes a balm, your stillness, a safe space. You stop needing to respond. you start learning how to truly witness. Buddhism doesn't ask you to never speak. It asks you to speak with intention. When your words come from wisdom, they no longer add to the noise. They bring light, they soothe, they cut through illusion like a bell in the fog. You begin to speak not for attention, but for awakening. Even a single sentence, spoken with presence, can be life-changing. People often fear that silence makes them invisible, but in truth, silence makes you luminous. When you no longer rush to fill the gap, you begin to radiate calm. It's not that you disappear, it's that you stop competing to be heard, and in that, you become unforgettable, not because of what you say, but because of the peace you carry. Speaking less doesn't mean knowing less. It means knowing what matters. The Buddha himself taught in silence as often as he taught in words, because sometimes truth is not something to be spoken, it's something to be felt, in the breath between sentences, in the stillness between ideas. And once you've touched that space, you'll never want to fill it again. There is a calm that comes from not needing to speak, not out of fear, not out of disconnection, but out of deep understanding that not everything requires a response, that not every moment needs to be filled. You begin to notice how words can sometimes interrupt what the heart is trying to say, and so you sit, still, present, and let the silence say it for you. In the absence of constant talking, something sacred happens. Your nervous system resets. You're no longer in performance mode. You're no longer reacting. You're simply being. And in that state, you begin to feel peace not as a concept, but as a living rhythm within your body. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. But it's steady, it's yours, and it was always waiting behind the noise. The modern world doesn't reward silence. It rewards speed, volume, opinion. But Buddhism reminds us the soul doesn't grow in the noise. It grows in the quiet. So every time you choose to stay still, you're choosing depth over distraction. You're choosing clarity over chaos. And in a world that shouts, your silence becomes your superpower. Monks spend years learning the art of silence, not just as absence of speech, but as presence of wisdom. They don't avoid words out of fear. They honor silence because it reveals the truth. Because when the mind quiets, the heart speaks. And what it says is rarely complicated, but always profound. Sometimes your deepest insight will rise in a moment where you said nothing at all. So ask yourself today, what am I speaking just to fill space? What am I avoiding by never being silent? You don't need to disappear. You don't need to be passive. You only need to be present, because the less you speak, the more the world listens. Not to your voice, but to your presence. What would happen if you stayed silent for just one day? Try it. Then return here and tell us, what did you notice? Share your experience in the comments. Someone else might need the reminder that silence isn't emptiness, it's healing.